Mr. President, I rise today to discuss something I regret. I regret that Democrats have allowed the word stimulus to become a dirty word, one that we avoid using. The President spoke a few weeks ago about his new plan to invest $50 billion in new infrastructure, projects that will improve safety and transportation, but he never once mentioned the word stimulus or recovery. And that was probably a smart move on his part, because frankly, the stimulus has gotten a bad rap. But this is a reputation that it absolutely does not deserve. There are members of this body who oppose the Recovery Act because they thought it wouldn't work or didn't jibe with their theory of economics or of how the government should address recessions, and that is fine. They are entitled to vote the way they thought best. But now, a year and a half later, we've been able to see the economic effects of the Recovery Act, and to deny that it has been a success is simply to ignore the facts. A recent poll showed that a majority of Americans believe that the stimulus bill either did nothing to help the economy or made it even worse. The economic data, however, indicate otherwise. How do we explain this disparity between what people believe and what the data support? Well, members of the American public don't form opinions out of thin air. They engage themselves, they watch the news, they listen to speeches by elected officials. And one would expect that watching the news and listening to your elected officials would be a decent way to form an opinion about something. But unfortunately, the talking heads on many of the news shows, along with many elected officials, have been feeding the American public half-truths, at best, about the Recovery Act. And that, frankly, is cheating the American people out of the facts. Today, I'd like to go through some of these claims made by these talking heads and elected officials, and then follow it up with some data. And that way, the American people can use the facts to decide for themselves. Let's take claim number one about the Recovery Act made by one of my colleagues in February. Quote, "It didn't create one new job." The Congressional Budget Office, the arbiter and referee of economic questions that we in the Senate all have agreed to abide by, reports that the Recovery Act has increased employment by 1.4 million to 3.3 million people. A separate report issued by two respected economists corroborates CBO's estimates, putting the figure at about 2.7 million jobs. That report was issued by Alan Blinder and Mark Zandi. That's Mark Zandi, who incidentally was a key economic advisor to the John McCain presidential campaign in 2008. Now, I understand that economic analysis has a lot of variables, that estimating jobs figures is very complex, and it's difficult to determine whether a job was created or saved. But when CBO and respected economists agree that employment has increased by millions of jobs, is it really at all plausible that the Recovery Act didn't create a single new job? Well, of course it's not. But that doesn't seem to stop some misinformed souls from claiming that. Now let's tackle a second claim. My friends on the other side of the aisle often imply that tax cuts would have been more effective than the Recovery Act, but perhaps they have forgotten that over 1/3 of the stimulus package of the Recovery Act was comprised of tax cuts, $288 billion of it. Unfortunately, the tax cuts were designed in a way so that many Americans didn't notice that they were getting them. An extra $20 on your paycheck adds up for you and the economy over time, but people don't notice like they do when they get a big lump sum rebate or refund. But here's the thing about lump sum refunds. People like to save them or pay off debts with them. When you get an extra 20 bucks in a paycheck, you're more likely to spend it, giving the economy a boost. This explains one unfortunate paradox of the Recovery Act, because the tax cut was well designed, it helped boost consumer spending, but nobody noticed it. But that's not a failure of Recovery Act policy, that's a failure of getting the message to the American taxpayers. And the tax cuts in the Recovery Act did their part. According to CBO, tax cuts for those in lower income brackets increased GDP by $1.70 for every dollar in tax cut. But for those who would argue that the Recovery Act should have been only tax cuts, consider this. While tax cuts for the lower brackets yielded a $1.70 GDP boost, tax cuts for higher income earners and companies only raised GDP by 50 cents per dollar spent. And neither of these figures compare to the return on the Recovery Act's public works investment, an impressive $2.50 increase in GDP for every dollar spent. After tax cuts, another substantial portion of the stimulus was fiscal aid to states. The Recovery Act provided about $224 billion to states so that they wouldn't have to slash essential state programs. State budgets across the country are in dire straits. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities estimates that 46 states will have budget shortfalls this year. Over the past 2 years, the Recovery Act has helped fill in a large percentage of state fiscal gaps. Imagine where state budgets would be had they not received assistance from the Recovery Act. Imagine the layoffs of teachers and firefighters and law enforcement and of people who deliver key social services for which there is far more demand during an economic downturn. Now let's look at another misleading claim, that the Recovery Act failed because it didn't keep the employment rate under 8%, as President Obama promised. Well, it's true that President Obama's advisors did not accurately forecast the gravity of the unemployment crisis, but frankly, nobody did. And because of the lag in unemployment data, we now know that unemployment had already surpassed 8% by the time the Recovery Act was signed into law. Now, let me walk you through this, because it's interesting, I promise. The claim about Obama's promise of keeping unemployment down actually came from a report issued by Obama's advisors on January 9th, 2009, before he took office. In early January, we only had access to job numbers through November. Now, back in November 2008, unemployment was about 6.9%. By December, it had risen to 7.4%. But the Recovery Act wasn't signed until February 17th. And by February, the unemployment rate had risen to 8.2%. So the unemployment rate was already over 8% when the Recovery Act was signed, let alone had any chance to go into effect. By that time, Obama's advisors, along with most other economists, had realized that the tide of unemployment was going to be much more severe. So it's fair to say that President Obama's advisors underestimated the coming employment crisis, but it's not fair to say that unemployment exceeding 8% was a failure of the Recovery Act. And it is preposterous to say that because a report issued by Obama's advisors, because a report issued by them contained an economic forecast that later proved to be inaccurate, therefore Obama lied, or that he broke his promise, or that he's an expert in snake oil, as I heard a talking head on a Sunday show say. A forecasting error is not a lie. Let's look at another claim. As an elected official has stated, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, since the stimulus was passed, we have lost 3 million real jobs, 2.4 million net jobs in this economy, and all the calculations and reports from the White House are not going to change the fact that their economic stimulus bill has failed. Okay, this is a fun one because technically the first part of the claim is correct. Since the Recovery Act, we've had a net job loss. Here is a chart illustrating the job losses mentioned. These are job losses here. See? Now you may notice a trend. I'm going to show another chart that might put this more in context. We'll get that in a second. Now, you may notice a trend here. This is President Bush. If we had a slide whistle, it would go. And if you had a slide whistle going for here's the Recovery Act, it would kind of go. Man, I can't do that right. See, there's a trend. You can tell by my slide whistle. The Recovery Act was clearly a turning point. We went from a downward slide into a relatively upward climb. It's not as fast as we would like, and things have been slightly stalled of late. But clearly, we're doing much better than this is Bush's last day in office. In fact, one could make the argument that the stimulus was key in reversing our slide into a depression. In fact, that's pretty much exactly what Blinder and Zandy have said about the Recovery Act. The Blinder-Zandy report, remember, this is Mark Zandy, who was John McCain's economic advisor. The Blinder-Zandy report sums it up this way. The government response to the crisis probably averted what could have been called Great Depression 2.0. Again, from the advisor to the 2008 Republican presidential candidate. I think avoiding a depression is on balance a good thing. And I think most Americans would agree. And if they knew the facts, they would thank President Obama and the members of Congress who kept us from sliding into another Great Depression. Let's look at a fifth claim. A prominent elected official said very recently that he thinks the Recovery Act created only bureaucratic government jobs. Only bureaucratic government jobs. In response to that, I'd like to show you a few recovery projects in progress in my state of Minnesota. You can judge for yourself whether they are bureaucratic government jobs. Now, I'm not sure how the camera works here in the Senate for those watching on TV, but maybe we can push in here on Jamie, a local 361 carpenter from Cloquet, Minnesota. Here he's performing scaffolding work on the north tower of the Duluth Aerial Lift Bridge. He's doing this in January 2010. The Duluth Aerial Lift Bridge, I think, is the largest in North America. The south tower will be completed this winter as part of the two-phase, $5 million project funded by the Recovery Act. Now, Jamie, his wife, and their two children, aged 19 and 14, went without health insurance for 13 months when he was on unemployment. He was hired for this job last winter and worked enough hours on this job to get back on health insurance. The Recovery Act has enabled Jamie and his family to get back on their feet. Now, I ask you, does Jamie look like a government bureaucrat? How about Cecil here? Get a picture of Cecil. And I want to ask you, does Cecil look like a bean counter for OMB? Cecil is pictured here working on a Highway 610 extension project in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. He's building 6 miles of sound walls. I attended the groundbreaking for this project. So did a Republican congressman from this district who voted against the stimulus package. Cecil has been employed since 2008. It was unemployed since 2008 before being hired onto this Recovery Act funded project. He's told us that he's very thankful for the opportunity to earn a living wage to support his family. Next, we have Spencer, a local 49er crane operator for a contractor named Lunda, working on 694-35W widening of bridge and on and off ramps of a bridge. It's a $2.5 million project. There are 11 on-site contractors, private contractors, working on the project. Spencer, who is 23, is from Isle, Minnesota, and was unemployed until this job came along. Spencer told me, "I wasn't working until this job came along. Investing in our country's infrastructure is an investment in my financial fate and family's future." As I said, he's local 40. The 49ers run heavy machinery. I don't know about you, but I don't know many Washington bureaucrats who can safely operate heavy machinery. Next, Matthew and Randy, both laborers, local 563. They had been employed by contractor C.S. McCrossan for 7 and 13 years respectively before they were both laid off last fall. But this spring, they were hired back to work on several different Recovery Act-funded projects. They are pictured here working on a pedestrian replacement bridge on 49th Avenue Northeast over Central Avenue in Columbia Heights, Minnesota. You can see them, they're just, a couple of CBO paper pushers, I guess. Next, we have Sheila. Here she is working on the night shift on the I-94 rehabilitation project. I-94 is a huge interstate highway in Minnesota, very important artery. Sheila is new to the construction industry, but her work ethic has led her colleagues to comment that she has a bright future in the industry. These are just a few of the 70,000 Recovery Act projects happening across our country. Here's another project in 2 harbors. These guys are building a water tower. In addition to 5 crews of workers on the project, the tower tank is made of 723,000 pounds of American steel. Let's get a little picture of it, a little bit more in progress here. 723 pounds of American steel, and the rebar is another 33,000 pounds of American steel, so additional American workers made this steel. And more American workers mined the iron ore, the taconite, Minnesotans on the Iron Range of Minnesota. More jobs. I visited 2 harbors on September 6th, just a few weeks ago, and personally saw this project in progress. As you can see, these folks aren't in suits and ties, shuffling papers. They're building bridges. They're building roads. They're building water treatment plants and water towers. These projects are going to improve transportation and the health and safety of people in Minnesota. And because of these jobs made possible by the Recovery Act, they will keep a roof over the heads of their families, put food on the kitchen table, send their kids to college, and yes, buy stuff. Another vital component of the Recovery Act is that is often overlooked is its expanded funding for unemployment insurance that helped keep 3.3 million people, including 1 million children, out of poverty in 2010. Another overlooked but critical program in the Recovery Act is the funding for Head Start. The $2 billion allocation preserved Head Start and early Head Start programming for 64,000 children across the country, over 900 in Minnesota. These programs are helping the most vulnerable kids in our communities. It's simple. Economic analysis suggests that the Recovery Act boosted demand, created millions of jobs, kept families in their homes, and helped the economy start growing again. Let me tell you what I love about being a senator, as opposed to being a candidate for the Senate. And I think most of my colleagues can relate to this. And the presiding officer has been a candidate, a statewide candidate, many times. When you're a candidate, you're speaking mainly to your own people. If you're a Republican, you're speaking to Republicans to get the nomination and then to get out the vote. If you're a Democrat, you're doing the same. But as a senator, you talk to everyone. And as senator, I've been privileged to go all around the state of Minnesota and talk to folks at economic development meetings. And I've talked to county commissioners and mayors and city councilmen and small businesses and community bankers. And you know what? I don't know what party they're in. And I don't care. We're trying to get people going. We're trying to get the economy going. And everywhere in Minnesota, you know what these folks say to me? Thank you for the Recovery Act. Thank you. Thank you for the teachers that we're able to keep on here in Brainerd. The firefighters, for the Workforce Investment Act funds, so we were able to train people for jobs that were available, but they didn't have trained people for them. Thanks for the highway underpass, so school buses don't have to cross the train tracks, or an ambulance doesn't have to cross the train tracks. Thanks for funds for the wastewater plant, or for rural broadband, or for the weatherization of public buildings. Speaking of which, Michael Grunwald, writing for Time magazine, wrote this. So the Recovery Act is the most ambitious energy legislation in history, converting the Energy Department into the world's largest venture capital fund. Is pouring $90 billion into clean energy, including unprecedented investments in a smart grid, energy efficiency, electric cars, renewable power from the sun, wind and earth, cleaner coal, advanced biofuels, and factories to manufacture green stuff in the U.S. The act will also triple the number of smart electric meters in our homes, quadruple the number of hybrids in the federal auto fleet, and finance far-out energy research through a new government incubator modeled after the Pentagon agency that fathered the internet. A few weeks ago, I heard a prominent conservative talking head on one of the Sunday news shows describe the Recovery Act this way. He said, if I pay my neighbor $1,000 to dig a hole in my backyard and fill it up again, and he pays me $1,000 to dig a hole in his backyard and fill it up again, According to the national income statistics, that's a $2,000 increment to GDP, and 2 jobs have been created. The American people understand, however, there's no real wealth created in this kind of transfer payment. How offensive. How out of touch. And yet, this is why so many Americans believe the Recovery Act hasn't created any jobs or just created jobs for bureaucrats. You know, I worry that my speech today is too little, too late. I worry that most Americans have already formed their opinion about the Recovery Act, and based on the inaccuracies they hear from Beltway pundits or from elected officials. But I challenge these talking heads and these elected officials to find the Spencers and Sheilas and Cecils and Randys in their state. Go out and watch them work, or talk to a teacher in a classroom or a cop on the beat. They're not digging and filling holes in their neighbors' backyards. They're doing skilled work, necessary work, hard work. Rebuilding our roads, teaching our children, and getting paid for it. With their paychecks, they buy food for their families and make their car payments and maybe buy a new one, which generates more demand. And that's an economic recovery in the making. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.